In this week's video, we return to the Birmingham Back-to-Backs for a Christmas visit. Hello and welcome to Through Lucy's Lens, weekly videos where I go somewhere interesting and hopefully you'll find them interesting too. My name is Lucy and I'm a social historian and your guide. I've returned to the Birmingham Back-to-Back several times now on the channel, and each visit reveals something different. Not because the houses change, but because the questions do. This is, without exaggeration, one of my most favourite museums in the world. Not because it's grand or rare, but because it tells the truth about how millions of people lived. On my visits, I always try and resist nostalgia. I don't think the back-to-backs lend themselves very easily to romance, and yet they still reward me on every visit, and I return again and again. So this visit is about Christmas. Not Christmas as an idea, but Christmas as it was lived here, in small rooms, shared spaces, with cold winters, and households where celebration had to fit around work, illness, and overcrowding. If you're interested in the detailed stories of individual families here, names, dates, personal histories, or even house layouts, those are explored in some of my other videos about the back-to-backs. This video is going to step back slightly. It looks at Christmas as an experience across time, using these houses as a framework. It might sound really daft to say, but I was really eager to see how they displayed Christmas here, and I've brought you along. Back-to-back houses were built in huge numbers in Birmingham and all across the United Kingdom from the late 18th century onward. In Birmingham, there was thousands built during the city's rapid industrial expansion. Back-to-back houses share a back wall with another house, meaning there's no through ventilation and very limited natural light. Most of the houses in Birmingham were built in courts, meaning some houses faced the street and others were accessed through an entry to access the back houses. Here you would also enter a courtyard where the toilet facilities and wash house, or brewhouse as it's known in Birmingham, were. Back-to-back houses are still enjoyed as homes in some cities such as Leeds, but here in Birmingham this is a rare survival of a way of life that was mostly demolished during the slum clearances of the 1950s and 1960s. These houses were occupied until the late 1960s. They were built cheaply, quickly, to house workers close to their place of employment. At their peak, tens of thousands of Birmingham residents lived in houses just like this. These were very ordinary homes. The first house is set in 1840 and reflects a Birmingham shaped by migration, industry and social change. The earliest occupants of this house were a Jewish family, for whom of course Christmas was not a religious festival. Even so, Christmas Day would have marked a shift in the city's rhythm. Streets were quieter, workshops slowed and daily routines altered. This house was originally not a slum dwelling. Like many early back-to-backs, it began life as a single home. Only later did the owner divide it, blocking off the back to extract rent from another family. That decision marked the beginning of overcrowding. By the 1840s, Christmas itself was in decline among the working poor. Older communal customs had faded and the festival was muted. Christmas carols were not yet widely revived, and the first commercial Christmas card was only sent in 1843, remaining a middle-class novelty for decades. Decoration where it existed was natural and minimal. Holly, ivy or evergreen branches might be brought indoors. Candles were used sparingly as an expensive commodity. There was absolutely no expectation of a Christmas tree. Work patterns dominated Christmas. A full day off was not guaranteed. If work stopped, wages stopped too. Winter brought with it the damp, cold and illness, and a Birmingham physician writing in the 1840s noted the effect of the close dwellings on winter sickness. These houses were only a short walk from Birmingham's markets. Fresh food was purchased daily when affordable, but there was no Christmas dinner in the modern sense. A family who might not have the luxury of meat might save for a goose or a rabbit. But the range in this house doesn't have an oven, so should a bird be roasted, this would need to be done in a communal oven. Often bakers would rent out their ovens to roast meat. This again may be a cost not afforded to all. A piece of bacon boiled in the pot with seasonal vegetables such as turnips, cabbage, potatoes and onions could be boiled on the range. Henry Mayhew, writing in London Labour and the London Poor in the 1840s, noted that many working families tasted meat but once or twice a week and some less. Christmas might be one of those occasions when meat was eaten, but not always. What we now call Christmas pudding was not yet standard amongst the poor in the 1840s. Where some kind of pudding existed, it was usually made with flour or breadcrumbs, a little suet and a small quantity of dried fruit if it was available. Many families had no pudding at all. Others shared one maybe between several households. A Birmingham woman later recalled of her childhood, pudding was for when there was something spare, not because it was Christmas. Christmas in the 1840s really was marked by a clean floor, a modest meal, and a brief pause before the routine of work resumed. What we are seeing at this point in the house, the stripped rooms, the exposed ware, the sense of things left behind, is closer to how many contemporaries described working class houses in the 1840s than later reconstructions often allow. Observers at the time were often blunt and frequently judgmental. Many commentators framed poverty as a personal failing rather than the result of circumstance, using moral language on those living in conditions they had little power to escape. Reports commissioned by poor law authorities and medical officers in industrial towns repeatedly described dwellings that were overcrowded, poorly ventilated and difficult to keep dry. Seasonal cold made these conditions worse, and Christmas fell squarely within that winter period. A report on urban housing conditions published in the 1840s noted that for many labouring families, the Christmas period brought no change in circumstance beyond a brief interruption to labour, where such interruption was possible at all. The emphasis was not on celebration, but on endurance. Christmas for the poor was not a separate mode of living. It took place within the same material limits that govern the rest of the year. Any pause from work was temporary. Any extra food was carefully calculated. Cleanliness achieved was quickly undone by damp, coal dust and constant use of space. Henry Mayhew, writing of working households in the 1840s, observed that seasonal festivals were felt chiefly in their expense, not their comfort. That expense, however small, had consequences. A slightly better meal would mean tighter days to follow. Children remembered Christmas less for what they received, but for what changed. A different meal, adults at home, a slower day. Modest distinctions, but they were noticed. And it's really important to say this clearly to modern eyes. These conditions look bleak, but for the people living here, they were not defined by sadness. They were living in the world available to them, adapting, managing and getting on with it, just like we do today. We're now moving through to the 1870s. By now, Birmingham had expanded rapidly and the pressure on housing had intensified. Back-to-back houses were now firmly established as working class accommodation, and many contained not only families but lodgers taken in to supplement wages. Census records from Birmingham courts, including this one, regularly show unrelated adults sharing kitchens, yards and fires, often in already crowded conditions. At Christmas, of course, these arrangements would not change. Lodgers would still occupy the beds and chairs, meals had to be shared, and space continued to be negotiated. Any sense of celebration had to fit around existing domestic realities rather than replacing them. This period is often associated with the rise of the so-called Victorian Christmas. But for the urban poor, that transformation was slow and uneven. Dickens' A Christmas Carol, published in 1843, had helped popularise ideas of family, unity, kindness and moral reflection. However, Dickens himself was careful not to depict excess. The Cratchits' family Christmas dinner, for example, is modest, and Dickens describes it pointedly as sufficient rather than abundant, a choice that reflected the lived reality of many working households. Contemporary commentary suggests that Christmas for the poor remained materially limited. An article in the Birmingham Daily Post in the early 1870s referred to many families for whom Christmas brings little change beyond the hope of a better meal, if work and wages allow it. Decoration in these households remained restrained. Greenery would be brought indoors, it would be gathered from hedgerows or churchyards, holly, ivy or evergreen branches. Christmas trees, although increasingly viable in middle-class homes by this date, were still uncommon in working-class dwellings, particularly in back-to-back houses like this, where space was limited and fire risk was a real concern. The tree displayed in the house, I'm sorry to say, is not at all realistic, and I think more of a nod to modern visitor expectations than reality. Cleanliness still counted at Christmas time. Floors would be scrubbed, ranges black, and clothes washed where possible. These acts were visible markers of care and respectability in a society quick to judge the poor. Food remained a central feature of Christmas. A joint of meat, if achieved, was the result of careful saving over many weeks. The vegetables were plain and filling. Pudding, where it appeared, was dense rather than rich, designed to stretch and fill you up. Some people might have had oranges or nuts, and they were remembered as particular treats, often limited to one per child. Winter illness remained a constant presence. Overcrowding, damp walls and poor ventilation contributed to coughs, chest complaints and fatigue. Medical reports from Birmingham in this period consistently note seasonal sickness amongst families living in close quarters like this. So Christmas in the 1870s was not defined by abundance, but I think by effort. An attempt to mark the season within circumstances that allowed little room for excess, but it didn't extinguish the desire to do so amongst the people who would have lived here. By the 1930s, where the third house you visit here is set, the back-to-back houses had become more recognisable to modern eyes, but they were still shaped by the same constraints of space, noise and limited means. Housing conditions had improved slightly since the 19th century, with some houses having some source of water or even gas or electricity. But the overcrowding remained common and privacy was still scarce. These houses were now old, damp and difficult to maintain. By the 1930s, Christmas was more firmly established as a family-centred occasion. The idea of Christmas as something for children in particular had taken hold. However, this didn't necessarily mean comfort or quiet. In fact, many former residents remembered Christmas as one of the noisiest times of the year. Catherine Dayas, writing of her Birmingham childhood in the interwar period, recalled, "The noise went on all day. People in and out, doors banging, radios playing, children shouting, and someone always arguing somewhere." Back-to-back houses like this amplified sound. Walls were thin, the courts were enclosed and voices carried easily. Radios were now quite common, and on Christmas Day many were turned up loudly, broadcasting music, variety shows and speeches. What one family in the court chose to listen to, the entire court often had to join in. By the 1930s, Christmas Day was more widely recognised as a holiday, particularly in factories and workshops. Many workers now expected at least Christmas Day off, and some had Boxing Day as well. However, this was not universal. Employment remained insecure for many, and wages were still low. Even when time off was granted, it was unpaid. Families planned carefully, knowing that a day without wages mattered. Christmas, for that reason, remained tightly budgeted. Food had improved compared to earlier decades, but it was still modest. Meat was definitely more likely to appear, often a small joint of meat or a chicken. The vegetables remained plain and hadn't really changed much since the 1840s. Puddings were more common now, however, sometimes shop-bought, sometimes homemade. Catherine Dayas remembered again. Christmas dinner was better than usual, but it wasn't grand. You knew it had taken weeks to put together. Alcohol also played a more visible role in some households by this period. Pubs were busy on Christmas Day, and drinking could spill back into the courts. Several oral history interviews from Birmingham recall Christmas arguments linked to drink, particularly in overcrowded homes where there was no space to withdraw. One former resident recalled, if someone had had too much drink, the whole court knew about it. There was nowhere to go. Christmas could also heighten tensions as well as warmth. Fatigue, drink and close living all collided. Presents for the children were more common by the 1930s, but still limited. Most children received 1 or 2 gifts at most. Toys were modest, a doll, a ball, a book or a game. It was common to give clothing, gloves, scarves, socks, often handmade. This was both a gift and also a necessity. Dayas recalled, you didn't expect much. If you got one thing, that was your Christmas. Oranges remained a familiar treat. Nuts and sweets were shared carefully. The emphasis was on making something last. Decoration was more visible than in earlier decades, but still restrained. Christmas trees were now more common in working class homes, though usually small and chosen to fit the room. Decorations could be inexpensive, particularly if they were handmade. Paper chains, tinsels and little snow angels. What mattered more than decoration, however, was the sense of effort. The houses would still be clean top to bottom. The best tablecloth would be brought out. Home was made nice, even if it could never be spacious or quiet. Illness, just like previous decades, remained part of Christmas life. Winter coughs, the flu, exhaustion were all common. Several residents recalled Christmas is overshadowed by sickness, particularly among older relatives. Care responsibilities fell largely to women who managed cooking, cleaning, nursing and the emotional labour simultaneously in these homes. Christmas rarely lingered. Decorations came down quickly. Washing resumed. Work returned. The back-to-back houses did not allow for extended leisure. What people remember, however, was not abundance but atmosphere, the noise, the effort, the closeness and the sense that Christmas, however briefly, had been marked. Moving forward into the 40s, 50s and 60s, Christmas became louder, more visible and more family focused than in earlier decades, but it was still bounded by space, money and fatigue. It still brought warmth and tension in equal measure. And for many, that balance feels immediately recognisable even to us today. I hope you enjoyed the Christmas visit to the back-to-backs with me. What these houses always show to me, particularly at Christmas, is this is not a story of deprivation defined by lack, but one that lives shaped by constraint and adaptation. The people who lived here worked within the limits that were structural, not personal. Space was fixed. Wages were finite. Illness, noise and fatigue were part of ordinary life. Christmas didn't remove these conditions, but it sat alongside them. Across the decades, Christmas here at the Back-to-Backs took different forms, but certain patterns remained constant. Care was taken where it could be. Cleanliness mattered. Food was planned carefully and stretched thoughtfully. Children were considered. The day was acknowledged even when it couldn't be transformed. These houses matter to me because they show how ordinary people whose voices are rarely heard, lived. Not as it's imagined. Christmas here was neither ignored or idolised. It was absorbed into the working lives, family responsibilities and shared spaces shaped by the same realities that governed the rest of the year. Returning to the Back-to-Backs is always personal for me. I grew up hearing family stories rooted in places like this. Not grand stories, but ordinary ones about winter, noise, food, and people making the best for one another. Coming back here is a way of placing those remembered fragments into a physical setting and helps me understand how such stories were formed in the first place. These houses allow me to think how Christmas was actually experienced as part of an everyday life shaped by work, family, health, and limited space. They help explain why certain memories linger. The effort involved, the closeness, the sense of marking time, even when your circumstances stay the same. If you have your own Christmas memories connected with back-to-back houses, courts, terraces, or similar places, I'd love you to share them in the comments. These buildings hold the story of many lives, but they also reflect countless others that lived beyond walls like this. Listening to those shared memories is one of the ways that social history continues. As always, thank you for coming with me. Please like, subscribe and do all of that uncomfortable but necessary YouTube business. It really helps the channel to grow and it helps me personally towards my goal of being able to spend more of my time dedicated to bringing voices from history alive. I'll see you on the next one then. Until next time, goodbye.